You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, we haven't gotten much news out of the Supreme Court this presidential term, but we do have some news now. Can you explain what just happened?
Yeah, so Chief Justice John Roberts issued what's called an administrative stay. Some people might spin this as some kind of a win for Donald Trump or the administration, but it really isn't. This is an administrative matter, and here's what happened. There is a federal district court judge in Washington, D.C., Judge Amir Ali, and he has been involved in the litigation of the USAID funds being frozen to the tune of in excess of $2 billion. And he issued a preliminary ruling saying that the Trump administration has to unfreeze the aid and begin to do what? Make good on its financial obligations, because believe it or not, there are some $2 billion of unpaid invoices that have been submitted by contractors. These aid organizations that are relying on the money the federal government has pledged to them, in a very real sense, that the federal government owes them. Congress allocated this money to go to these aid organizations, and the Trump administration just said nope and put a freeze on it. Well, Judge Ali said, no, lift the freeze and make good on these financial obligations, these unpaid invoices that are rolling in. And Brian, the reporting is some of these aid organizations are being devastated because all of a sudden the money that should have come their way, that they were relying on to come their way, just froze. It just stopped. So then, of course, the Trump administration beat feet up to the Supreme Court, Donald Trump's Supreme Court, as he likes to call it, and asked that Chief Justice Roberts, who has supervisory responsibility over the federal district in Washington, D.C., basically put an administrative pause on this order from Judge Ali to immediately lift the freeze. Now, the Trump administration went into court and said, oh, we can't do it. It's too hard. We can't do it this quickly. And it felt like Judge Ali might have been moving in the direction of possibly holding the Trump administration in contempt for not complying with the order to lift the freeze. And the one thing that this administrative stay, this pause put in place by Chief Justice Roberts does, it kind of heads off the contempt battle at the pass, just kind of stops everything dead in its tracks, maintains the status quo. So this is something of an administrative win, just kind of putting a pause on Judge Ali's order, but it is really not much of a substantive legal ruling beyond that. What happens next? Well, very likely Chief Justice Roberts will refer this issue to the full court, and it may very well be that before too long, the entire Supreme Court will take on the issue of the Trump administration trying to shut down, cut off, freeze all of this money that had been allocated by Congress to be part of our USAID efforts overseas.
Glenn, if Elon Musk and Doge and the Trump administration basically cancel out contracts that we are obligated to pay anyway, wouldn't you agree that it's just forcing us to pay what we're obligated to pay and then chalking it up as if it's saving billions of dollars? But at the end of the day, if that money is going out the door because we have a legal obligation to pay it, then we're not really doing anything.
Brian, in my opinion, none of this is about, finding fraud, cutting waste, responsibly limiting the amount the federal government spends on any and all programs. It's really about creating chaos, instilling fear and terror in the federal government workforce, some 2.1 million public servants. It's not about saving money. And let me use an analogous situation. Donald Trump with the, dirty assistance of Elon Musk, it looks like are engaging in all kinds of potentially wrongful terminations of government employees. What does that mean? That means suits will be filed, and if successful, as other suits have been in the past when Donald Trump has tried this same dirty scheme, the federal government has to pay out, right? So the federal government loses financially at the end of the day. I'll use as an example Andy McCabe, the former, deputy director of the FBI, an acting director at one point, who was wrongfully terminated. He had to go to court. He had to fight the wrongful termination. He won. And then our taxpayer dollars have to go to satisfy that judgment for the person who won a wrongful termination suit. Brian, this is nonsense that any of this is about actually saving the federal government money. It's about creating chaos and instilling fear.
I would also add one thing to that, and that is that under this pretense of cutting government waste and abuse and fraud, all of which seems to not be able to stand up under its own weight when there's any scrutiny applied whatsoever. What's your reaction to the fact that, for example, one of those programs that was called some big, wasteful, bloated program was a contract that the federal government had inked for billions of dollars with Verizon that now is in the process of being rescinded so that the same contract could be awarded to another guy who just so happens to own a space terminal company named Elon Musk for SpaceX?
This is a conflict of interest jamboree. And who is benefiting from it? Elon Musk. Nobody in government should be permitted to, take actions as a federal government employee that, if implemented, will inure to their own financial benefit. And Brian, if they were really looking to get at fraud, waste, abuse, and corruption inside the executive branch, would they have fired all of the inspectors general, basically our cops on the inside of the executive branch, whose sworn mission is to make sure they ferret out fraud, waste, abuse, and corruption in the executive branch? Come on, that one is an easy one.
Okay, well, Glenn, going back to the Supreme Court, what are next steps here? Because as you said just a few moments ago, this is a temporary ruling, and I know that Trump's team is going to point to this as some big victory here, but this isn't their permanent decision here. So what are the next steps?
Yeah, that's a great question, because this is not an easy procedural call. Let me just take a step back. Ordinarily, these preliminary rulings by a trial court to, instantly address immediate irreparable harm, things like preliminary junctions and temporary restraining orders, are not immediately appealable. And there's a good reason for that. Until a full record has been established in the trial court, only the trial court has fact-finding capabilities. Appeals courts don't have fact-finding capabilities. So ordinarily, there has to be a full-blown trial. There has to be, full litigation on an issue. That issue has to be ruled on, resolved by the trial court before it can begin to be appealed up the appellate chain. So, this temporary administrative pause is kind of a half step toward the Supreme Court deciding whether this case might be ripe for them to take up some of the larger questions about whether the executive branch should be entitled to just completely violate all of its obligations that it has made to foreign countries as part of USAID that Congress has allocated go to foreign countries, or if they're going to say, listen, we're going to maintain the status quo, but we're going to return it to the trial court so they can have a full-blown trial. They can litigate the issues, they can enter into fact-finding, and then once all of that has settled, then they can appeal it up to the D.C. Federal Circuit Court of Appeals and ultimately the Supreme Court if they choose to exercise jurisdiction over the case. So we're in this kind of procedural middle ground right here where we're going to have to wait to see what the Supreme Court says next about, which direction they want to sort of send this case off into.
Glenn, let's finish off with this. And I know this is a little bit of a futile exercise here, but do you have confidence, at least from what you've seen, from how you've seen the Supreme Court comport itself recently as it relates to these governmental cases, which, there's not much, but that do you have confidence that the Supreme Court will be a fair arbiter of what happens next?
Yeah, it's hard for me to spit out the phrase, I have confidence in this Supreme Court when
Right.
it comes to anything. I don't think I would, let the justices make change for $1 for me. But here's the thing. Let me take a step back and be fair, because remember, if we look back a few years ago, 2020, with the 60 or 65 election challenge cases, the Supreme Court held. They didn't take responsibility. They didn't accept any of those cases for review and potentially undermine Joe Biden's win. But more recently, Brian, whether it's the 14th Amendment disqualification case because Donald Trump is an adjudicated insurrectionist, whether it is the absolute presidential immunity case, those are rulings where I don't think the Supreme Court remained loyal to the express language of the Constitution. So I think things are trending in a way that leads me to conclude I have very little confidence in the Supreme Court. But, the thing that I see right now, Brian, is Donald Trump is building a record of abuse. He's building a record of being entirely willing to violate our nation's laws. For example, firing inspectors general in violation of a legal statutory requirement that he give Congress 30 days advance notice before he do it. And then if he tries to do it, he has to give fact-based reasons, deficient performance by the inspectors general. I don't think the Supreme Court will turn a blind eye to the mounting record of Donald Trump's abuse, his corruption, his illegality, and his unconstitutionality in his executive orders, like when he tries to revoke